Hello everybody, my name is Zeke. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, if you saw the title, you're expecting a June wrap-up, and in some ways that is what I'm going to give you, but I did lie a little bit. I'm actually recording this about 10 days before the end of the month, so technically June is not done. I will probably read a few more books in the month, but I figured this would be a good chance to also wrap up the past few months, April and May, because I really didn't read that much, and so I didn't do a full wrap up for them. But I feel like now it's time. I have like 8 books I can talk about, and I could lie a little to just wrap up the video with a nice title. So I'm going to talk about all these books I read from I think the start of April through now, and I hope you enjoy learning about them. So the first book I read, kind of a random choice, I didn't really know much going into it, that was The Rules of Attraction by Bret Easton Ellis. This book is very chaotic, very stream of consciousness. We're basically following these college students as they just are absolutely awful to each other and are just doing awful things. It's a very vulgar book, both in the content and in how it's written. It really doesn't shy away from showing any content, so there's a lot of stuff going on. But we're basically just seeing how all these characters interact with each other and with people kind of outside of the main perspectives we're following, and struggle with like their sexuality, but also just their place in the world as these college students. We at one point meet one of their families and we see that kind of awful situation. And honestly, what I did enjoy about this book the most is that we really see the characters not change that much. These people are not like learning from their mistakes. It's not that kind of book. And I think that that really helps the message that the book is trying to show about how these people are so lost and kind of unsure of themselves. I think it really helps spread that message, and I think I'm just very happy with the way all those characters were handled. But also I don't think this book is for everyone, because it is very vulgar and very stream of consciousness, and all the characters are very unlikable, so I would just keep that in mind. But overall, I enjoyed it, especially more than I expected, because I knew like nothing going into it, and I gave it like 4 stars. The next one was actually a nonfiction book, which I barely ever read, and that was Monsters of Fan's Dilemma by Claire Dederer. I wanted to read this just because I've seen it a lot, and I wanted to read more I've been wanting to read more nonfiction. Honestly, this was pretty disappointing. I think there's a lot of interesting takes in there. It's about the idea of like cancel culture, which I feel like I should have known going into it that maybe it wasn't going to be the most interesting thing to read, because I feel like for me, I spend so much time on the internet that I feel like I've heard every single perspective on cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, possible. So I feel like I personally didn't get a lot out of it. But I think some of the conversations the author has, she basically goes through just a bunch of different case studies and examples. I think the chapter titles are like The Monster as This. It's not exactly that, but like stuff like that to kind of focus on specific people, and also like broader archetypes of people, I guess is the way you'd phrase that. And I think it's interesting if it's a topic you feel like you don't know a lot about. I don't think there was anything wrong with it. It just, for me, I feel like I didn't really get anything out of it, because I felt like I'd heard all the conversations that she was bringing up. Something I wasn't a huge fan of is she has more like memoir-y bits in it where she talks about her writing this book and like her perspective on things that I would usually like in nonfiction. I just didn't find her perspective on it necessarily that interesting, and that could have just been a me thing. I don't really know if that's like a common take on this book, but overall it wasn't great for me, but might work for other people. I would just like look into the topic and see if it's interesting first before like committing to it, because for me by the end I was like, I need this to be over. I feel like I'm hearing the same thing over and over. Next I read Toni Morrison, Jazz. I've been slowly making my way through all of Toni Morrison's books, and this is just the next one I happened to pick up. This is kind of like the second in a trilogy, like the only trilogy she's written. The first book is Beloved, and then there's this, and then I think the third book's called Paradise, but they're not really that related. You don't have to read them in order. I think you probably should, but they're not connected. I mean, they're connected like thematically, but they're not connected with like the plot. And this book, honestly, in like the grand scheme of Toni Morrison books I've read, is probably near my least favorite, if not my least favorite. But I think it's really incredible how I can say that and still say like I really enjoyed this book. In this book, we're following, well, we start out with this kind of love triangle where there's this husband and wife, and the husband has an affair with a younger woman and ends up killing her, and then the wife goes to her funeral and slashes her face with a knife. That's not a spoiler, that's like all revealed in the first like not 5 pages, maybe 5 pages. Very quickly we find all of that out, and that kind of sets the stage for Toni Morrison to talk about all these characters' lives and their family lives and their relationships with each other, with other people in Harlem where the story takes place, how their families came from different places in Virginia, how they met up, and their whole kind of life stories kind of revealed in little flashbacks, and she drip feeds it to you. It's not all at once, which I really like. I love her writing style always. Her writing's incredible. That's the best part of this book for me. Personally, I really liked the premise. I don't think everything necessarily connected with me as much as I wanted it to, but there was nothing like wrong with it. Still a very good book. Still, I think did everything it set out to do, and I'm still happy I read this. I think I wanted almost a little more from the main premise than we got, because we're flipping around a lot through these other stories, but at the same time, like, I don't know if that's actually would have been good. Like, that's just kind of what I wanted going into this book. But overall, still really enjoyed, still gave it like 3.5, probably 4 stars realistically, just because I feel like Toni Morrison really can't write anything bad or even like mid-tier. It's always going to be at least decent, and I think this definitely was. But I just wouldn't recommend this as like a first Toni Morrison. I'd say read a lot more and then like get to this eventually. Next, I read a sci-fi book that I've been wanting to read for a while. That's Remnant Population by Elizabeth Moon. Really enjoyed this. This is a standalone sci-fi book, which don't see often, and I was just really happy about, because I wanted something that I could just read and be done with. And this story, we're following this woman who ends up left behind on a planet purposefully. Like, she decides to stay behind. She was there as part of this colony that was based around this company that then kind of lost the rights to the planet or whatever. That part's kind of foggy to me, I don't remember. But we basically go from there, and she wants to stay on the planet because this is her life at this point. She basically just doesn't want to up and leave. She doesn't see the point. She's fine living alone. She wants to live alone. She's kind of pissed off with her son and her daughter-in-law. She doesn't really get along with them. And I think that kind of premise really sets the stage for what I love so much about the book, which is this main character. She is complicated. She is not always the most likable, but like, she shouldn't be the most likable. The way she acts, she's always complaining about things. She's always making like comments, trying to find the right word, and I can't really think of it, but she's just she's always complaining. Like, she's not always happy and excited about everything that happens, even when I don't want to say too much, but like when the plot starts picking up, she's just kind of grumpy all the time. But I think that kind of makes her very likable. Also, her perspective on the world, on privacy, on having this space alone, I think is very interesting, and what kind of compelled me a lot to like her a lot, actually. And overall, I would say like the plot of this book isn't really, like, there's not a ton happening. It's kind of, it doesn't even pick, I would say it doesn't even pick up that much until at least like a third of the way through. But I think the strength of this character and the strength of this character's relationships with others as the book progresses, I think is the emotional heart of this book. And I think that emotional core is so strong that even though it is a little bit of a slower sci-fi book, it still gripped me wholeheartedly, and I'm really glad that I finally read it, and I gave it 4 stars. Next, on a whim, I picked this out because it was available at the digital library and I couldn't find anything else. I read The Guest by Emma Cline, and I ended up really loving it. I think people really don't like this book. According to Goodreads, it has like a 3.22 rating, if I remember correctly. But I can definitely see why. This book, we're basically following this woman who is in the Hamptons out on Long Island. She's away from the city. She goes out east, and she's like living with this man, and things kind of go south pretty quickly. She's kind of kicked out of the house, and the whole story, we're following her roaming around, just going from place to place, people to people, and being kind of miserable. She's not a fun character to be around. Like, she does bad things, and she doesn't really have like motivation necessarily to do them. But this actually reminded me a lot of, and I think I wasn't expecting this going in because I didn't know that much about the book, but The Swimmer by John Cheever. which is a short story that I love so much. It's probably my favorite short story of all time. That story is about this man who one day decides to swim all the way home across all the swimming pools in his neighborhood. Weird premise, really good. It's like a subversion of the hero's journey trope, and we kind of get this here too. And I just really loved it because of that link, and also I thought the writing was good. I liked this character. Like, I didn't like this character, but I liked how the character was written, and I was just invested. There's nothing going on. Like, this is another no plot really book, but I was just really invested in this character. I thought she was very interesting to follow, so I enjoyed this immensely. I think I gave it a 4 like originally, but I'd even maybe up that to a 4.5 the more that I think about it, because it's really sticking with me, and it made me want to read her other book, The Girls. I've heard mixed things about that, but I'm interested, and I can't wait to see what she puts out next, because I think she only has 2 books out and like 1 short story collection, so she's new author-ish, and I'm just excited to see where she goes after reading this. Next, I read Boulder by Eva Baltazar. I saw this on like TikTok or whatever, and usually like that's not my scene. I'm not gonna read things that I see on TikTok, but the premise of this seemed really interesting. We're basically following this woman who meets another woman. They kind of fall in love and move to Iceland, and we're watching them live their life together. It's short, I don't want to say too much, but they have a lot of struggles in their relationship. There's discussions of like parenthood and love, obviously, if we're looking at this relationship over time. It's a simple story at the end of the day about how these 2 people come together and how their lives go from there, but it's written in such a beautiful way. I think this might be one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, writing-wise. The metaphors in this book, I wish I hadn't returned it to the library already so I could pull out some quotes, but absolutely beautiful. It is very flowery writing, so if that's not your thing, you're not gonna like this, but I think that the writing alone was absolutely mind-blowing, and I think the story it told ended up being very beautiful and very complicated, and I really enjoyed following these 2 complicated characters as we kind of see them struggle, honestly. And yeah, it was kind of, I didn't really know what to expect going in because I didn't really know that much about it other than the premise and that I'd seen it around recently, but I'm very glad I read this. And this is another 4.5, honestly, so close to being perfect. I think, yeah, it just really struck me hard and is really going to stick with me, and I'm going to want to reread that one definitely, because I think there's a lot going on there. Especially in the writing that I probably missed just because I was reading it for the first time, but absolutely beautiful book, and so glad I ended up picking it up. 2 more books to talk about. They're both kind of collections of shorter work. The first is Slouching Towards Bethlehem by Joan Didion. Joan Didion is one of my favorite authors. I've read, I want to say, at least half, if not most of her books at this point. This is one of her most popular. It's her debut, and somehow I haven't gotten to it until now. This is probably honestly my favorite nonfiction of hers. She writes some fiction books and then some, or she did write, she's dead now. She wrote some nonfiction, like memoir stuff. This is memoir stuff, and she wrote some fiction. This is a collection of essays about herself, about various events that happened surrounding areas that she knows about, and then also different places that have meant something to her life, and just very beautiful storytelling. She has really beautiful writing. That's a running theme throughout this stretch of books I'm talking about. The writing, it was incredible, always is incredible. The way she talks about people, the way she talks about herself, the way she talks about things she cares about and places she cares about, and imbues them with so much life, and the atmospheres that she constructs are so vivid, even if you have no experience to tell you to inform you what she's talking about. The way she's able to paint these pictures of people and places, I just think is very powerful and very impressive. And yeah, I think it's hard to talk too much about this because it's like shorter essays, but there's some really beautiful essays about, I think particularly one that stood out to me was about Sacramento, and like the area she grew up, and she talks a lot about California in this book. That's kind of what she's known for, I think, for this book in the 60s and 70s. or in the 60s. This came out in 68. And I don't know, it's just really interesting time capsule, but also I think the personal stories in this kind of will never get old, and they're always going to be relevant because they are so personal and they are so emotionally sound that I think they'll always resonate with people, and they definitely resonated with me. So I gave this 5 stars. Absolutely loved this. Definitely think out of all like the essay collections I read from her, I'll definitely come back to this the most. One thing I will say is there's 3 sections to this book. The first one is kind of more impersonal, I would say. It's talking about like just random kind of events that she finds interesting. And I liked them, but they didn't like wow me. But then we got into the second and third parts, which are the personal stories and then the stories about like places. And those were absolutely incredible. And that's what kind of made this a 5-star for me. So I would very much recommend like going into this. I wouldn't say skip I think they're still good, but if you like start reading it and you're like not really connecting with it, I would definitely say try some of the more personal ones, because I think those are her best. And I think those are just those are what stick with me the most, at least. So yeah, very happy I finally read this. The final book I have to talk about is Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata. This is a short story collection by the author of a few other books I've read, Convenience Store Woman and Earthlings. I really liked Earthlings. It's been a while since I read it, but very weird book. In her novel, she writes a lot about like social outcasts and societal expectations. And I was kind of expecting that going into this, and that's definitely what I got. These are weird stories about people doing weird things, participating in strange activities as if they are normal, and kind of, it's a lot of social commentary on, societal expectations and kind of norms and what happens when we break them. And there's some really interesting stories in here. I don't think every single one hit me, but I think especially the longer ones in here, there were some really interesting ideas that she talked about and really interesting premises that I just thought were really fun to read, honestly. I think in particular there was a story about a society where after people die, instead of funerals, they come together for life ceremonies. It's the title story, and they actually eat the dead person. So obviously, yeah, that kind of gives you a sense of how weird these stories are. That was one of the best, I'd say, in here. I also really liked the last one, which is about this woman who has these multiple personalities that she's cultivated throughout her life, and she has to kind of come to terms with them and reconcile them in the present. And just really interesting social commentary about how we present ourselves to the world, and also how other people see us, and how they kind of react when not everything meshes the way that they expect. And yeah, that's just 2 of the ones I really liked in here, but overall very enjoyable. Some of the shorter ones didn't connect as much with me just because they were so short. Also, one more thing I will say is the writing in here is, I think, very specific. I think it works here because she writes in a more cryptic, and I'd say it's kind of blander, like it's not like really flowery writing, but I think for these that really works because it helps build that kind of unsettling atmosphere. And there's a lot of ambiguity in these stories, especially in the endings. Like they don't really satisfy per se, but I think that writing style, and also with the kind of theme she's talking about, that really works very well. And I really enjoyed this, gave it 4 stars. Enjoyed it more than I expected to even, so very glad I finally picked this up too. So overall, those are all the books I've been reading recently-ish, and hopefully I'll be able to read a lot more over the summer. We'll kind of see how that goes, but it's been very successful, honestly. I think most of these were 4 stars. I think the only one I didn't really like was Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma, but I don't know, that was kind of a throwaway for me. And yeah, some really amazing books I've been reading. Very excited to have read them and be reading more in the future. So if you like this video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.